All right. So thanks so much for being here with us today, folks, for this presentation hosted by Dashew Center and our lovely Professor Masuoka here. So my name is Jenna Bustamante. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs at Dashew Center, and we were very glad to be able to put together this Zoom event for us today. As many of you likely know, the US presidential election is tomorrow. There's a lot of other things that are being voted on as well, but the one that you've likely heard the most about is the presidential election. So we wanted to host this event and provide information so that our international community feels more informed, right, about what's going on all over UCLA and LA and the US. So I reached out to Professor Masuoka and she agreed to host this for us today. So I'll go ahead and share a little bit about who she is. So she is an associate professor of political science and Asian American studies. Research interests include racial and ethnic politics, immigration, political behavior, and public opinion, which is why we thought she was fabulous to host this for us today. She has a book, The Politics of Belonging, Race, Public Opinion, and Immigration, which examines how and why whites, Blacks, Asian Americans, and Latinos view immigration and immigrants in systematically different ways. She has another book called Multiracial Identity and Racial Politics in the United States, which explores the rise of Americans who self-identify as mixed race or multiracial and the impact on politics. She received her PhD and her MA from UC Irvine and a BA from Cal State Long Beach. And before joining us at lovely UCLA, she taught at Tufts University and Duke University. So please welcome Professor Masuoka, and I'll pass it to you.
Well, thank you, Jenna, and thank you to the staff of the Dashew Center for the invitation. It's always an exciting time to be a political science professor as we head into the election tomorrow. So I guess just a little bit of context, I guess, of where I thought we were coming from, but also just to welcome our audience to ask other questions and help direct me towards answering maybe some questions that you all as students have that I may not necessarily be answering in the PowerPoint. So we thought we would do is first do really like what I'm going to call a primer in American elections. So, and actually this happens, not even for our international student community, but even when I'm just out and about in my daily life with family, that people really just have questions about, for example, like what's the Electoral College? Why am I listening to all of these things, right? And so on the news. And so I think every time we have an election, I think it's really great for us to have just some kind of basic background so that we can be confident consumers of political information as we go into the election tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit about some of the controversies that are going on relating to voting rights access today, which is primarily an area of my specialization, research specialization. And then we can, of course, have question and answers from the audience if there are other issues that you would like us to discuss. We are being recorded, and hopefully this is something that we can share with the larger international student community, but I also just wanted us to be mindful that this will likely be shared after we are done today. So first, we'll start off with my short presentation here. We got a nice little PowerPoint. I'm gonna get this up and going here. Okay, so and as a warning, I do have a little bit of trouble seeing the chat when the PowerPoint is up. So if our Dashew staff wouldn't mind, if there's some question that comes up, clarification question that comes up as I'm talking to the screen, I would appreciate it. So we'll do it that way as opposed to me running the chat, since it's a little bit hard for me
Sounds
to
good.
run.
I can absolutely
Okay,
do that for you.
lovely. Thank you, Jenna. Okay, so I'm basically calling this a primer in American elections. So just kind of some of the things that I'm anticipating, basically from my own experience, people have questions about when we go into the election, and things that they're talking a lot about on the media that folks just want a little bit of clarification on. And so, I think the first thing which I don't know if we all have questions about, but I think in some ways for an international student community, just to get some vocabulary on the table. The question for tomorrow is the biggest question I think being asked is, right, who's running for president? But one of the things that I think we should be aware of is also just generally some of the shorthand names and things that people are using as they talk about the election. So first, we have two major parties in the United States, the Republican Party, which is usually designated with the color red. You also might see it designated with an elephant, since that is, effectively the party mascot. It's also referred often to as the GOP, which stands for Grand Old Party. So you might hear or see some of this symbology or imagery listed, in particular when we're talking about the Republican nominee for president, which is former President Donald Trump. And then our other major party is the Democratic Party. The symbology oftentimes is being presented as blue. The mascot is a donkey. And currently, our nominee for representing the Democratic Party is Vice President Kamala Harris. Oftentimes, what is also stated is the word independent. And this is what I have historically understood is what causes some confusion when we talk about party identification in the United States. So we do typically call ourselves in the United States a two-party system, mainly because it's really been only two parties that have been dominant players in election outcomes throughout the United States. It hasn't always been the Republicans and Democrats. There's been other names for these two major parties, but in general, we've been a two-party system. But that doesn't necessarily mean we only have two parties in the United States. So we have other parties. Typically, people refer to those as third parties, mainly because we assume that there's two major parties and then there's these other smaller parties. Currently, our other third parties are Peace and Freedom Party. There's a party called the American Independent Party, Libertarian Party, and the Green Party. And so these are third parties that are represented also. They have their own organizations. They have their own nominees for president on the ballot. It is confusing because we do have a third party called the American Independent Party. However, oftentimes American voters themselves will say that they are quote unquote independent. And I think for clarification, I'll call that they self-identify themselves as independent. Oftentimes in practice, Americans use the word independent to refer them to themselves as people who don't necessarily identify primarily with either of the two parties. So they don't identify as a Democrat and they don't identify as a Republican. They also don't identify as a third party. So they call themselves independent because basically they feel that they're independent, right, from being identifying from a party. Here in the state of California, we actually do not require you to state that you are affiliated with a party. And you can actually register as a voter as what we call a no party preference. And so that also increases, especially here in California, people using the term that I'm an independent. And so this oftentimes can be confusing, right? Because there's a third party, but then there's also people who generally think of themselves as not necessarily identifying as either one. In the media, they often refer to those folks as quote unquote swing voters. They call them swing voters, which are basically people, right, that don't always vote for the same party every single election. So they don't vote Democrat every single election, right? That sometimes they vote for the Democratic candidate, sometimes they vote for the Republican candidate. And so independents are also often referred to as swing parties in the mainstream media. Okay, so this is just some clarification of terms. The other question that I get is, what does it take to win the election, right? So everyone wants to know, how do we determine the winner, right? So after Tuesday, who's going to be our president, right? Is it going to be Harris or is it going to be Trump? And this is what causes some confusion because we vote in the United States and our vote is really important. And I'm going to talk a great deal about why voter turnout is so important in our country. But One of the ways in which we have created in the Constitution since our founding is that the popular vote doesn't directly determine the election of the president. In other words, the person who gets the most votes across the nation isn't necessarily always going to be the winner and the person who is going to be elected president of the United States. We are increasingly aware of this in our main, kind of more contemporary elections because it's happened actually twice in a row in most people's lifetimes here that are currently voters. Most of us around my age or older remember the 2000 election, which was an election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, where Gore won the popular vote, but was not our elected president. And then more recently in 2016, when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, in other words, she won the most votes across the country, right? But was not president. Donald Trump was elected president. Why does this happen, right? So why is it that when we talk about a democracy, we talk about the importance of voting, why is the person who gets the most votes not the person who gets to be president? And that is some of the things that we teach about when we teach a introduction to civics class or an introduction to American government class, which I've taught historically, but which we teach in the political science department as a foundational understanding about how our constitutional framers thought about the election, thought about voters, and actually had some skepticism about allowing the direct election of president based on everyday voters. And so our framers had some suspicions that perhaps voters could be swayed in unintentional ways, or they could be manipulated. So they had a lot of distrust in what we call the direct election from voters. And so they integrated into the Constitution what we call the Electoral College. And so what the Electoral College is it is effectively each state gets Electoral College delegates that serve in the Electoral College. It's equal to the number of seats that each state holds in Congress, which is equal to the total number of House of Representative seats and your US Senate seats. So each state, depending on their population size, gets a share of Electoral College delegate seats. Those delegates then serve as each state's Electoral College delegates. We call them delegates. They can't necessarily be people who already serve in Congress, right? They are already serving in another elected office. So they're actually separate people that we are electing during an election. And so those delegates basically are what we're effectively voting for when we close the election on Tuesday. And then those delegates will then cast their vote in the Electoral College for the president. If there, then there's all of these different rules about, kind of what happens with the tie, right? And so then it gets turned over to Congress. And so these are all the different rules here that are written out in Article 2 of the Constitution, which describes the process for presidential elections. We added some amendments, such as Amendment 12, which talks about different things for claiming Electoral College votes. So I think these are areas. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I could probably go into a whole hour's conversation here about exactly some of the technical aspects of the Electoral College. But effectively, what we want to know, right, is that it's who we're voting for when we cast our ballot through this coming Tuesday are our delegates for the Electoral College. And so when I talk to everyday voters, they get really confused, right? And I realize that some of our international student community has not seen this, but I do want to show you this. So when we as voters look at our ballot, they know that, if you took an intro to elections course or a government course, or you've been listening to the media and you know about the Electoral College, and you have some awareness, right, that in the Electoral College we're actually electing the delegates in our state to then cast ballots for the election, right? So it's many ways an indirect election. But then voters are confused because they're like, well, when I actually cast my ballot, I don't see electoral college delegates on my ballot. I don't know who am I even voting for. And what they see is basically this is a screenshot of my sample ballot from LA County on the left-hand side. And you can see there's no wording here, right, about electoral college or delegates. They see actually the nominees for president, right? So they see the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, right, at the top, and then the third one down is Kamala Harris, our Democratic nominee. And so it's confusing. And so what actually in practice states have done is they use what we really call use a shorthand ballot so people can see directly who, right, they would like electors to vote for. And so they are shown only the nominees for president. And the idea here is by sharing who you would like to win, right, you are sharing your preference to the delegates who will then vote, right, for the preferred candidate of your state in the electoral college. And so what we're seeing as voters, right, is really who we're trying to influence, right, the electoral college delegates to vote for when they cast their ballots in the electoral college. And so this is what we usually see when you're looking at any kind of newspaper, social media, right? The news analysis is effectively this map, which is usually, right, colored in, blue and red to designate the electoral college. Where usually, right, the blue, when we color a state blue, it is designating that state's electoral college delegates are going to cast their votes for the Democratic candidate, right? And then the states colored in red are those states that are going to cast their electoral college delegate votes for the Republican candidate. I'm using this one. This one is an old one from 2008, or I'm sorry, so 2012. But I wanted to put this one in here because you can see the numbers underneath because those are the total number of electoral college delegates, right, that each state was given. So you can see here that they vary, which with more populous states given more electoral college delegate seats, right, than some of our more rural states. So going back to our question, right, how is it that we get to the case where we have candidates who received less than the popular vote, right, but were elected to the office of the president? So one thing I think we're going to see here is we need 270 electoral college delegates votes to win the office of the president. But the way that we calculate the electoral college can what we call magnify the winner. And so the formula for calculating the winner in the electoral college vote sometimes can create some perverse outcomes, which is that it doesn't necessarily directly result from the popular vote. So generally the way that we work the electoral college is it's what we call a winner-take-all system. So when we cast our ballots in each state, right, the candidate that gets 51% or 50 plus one votes. So the majority of the votes cast in a state will get all of the electoral college votes of that state. So it's not proportional, right? So it's not necessarily that if you get 45%, you get 45% of California's electoral college delegates, and that gets cast. If 50% plus one Californians vote for, say, the Democratic candidate, all 55, right, of our electoral college seats are going to go towards the Democratic candidate. And so because of this winner-take-all system and the formula for calculating the electoral college, this in some ways then makes it that we can have people who didn't necessarily receive the most votes, right, but might receive the most votes in the electoral college, will then win the office of the president. So here we can see, here's an example of some of the math here that's involved with the electoral college system. So for example, in 1992, Clinton won 43% of the popular vote across the nation. But because of the specific states that he won, the majority of votes were, that calculated actually to 69% of the electoral college seats, resulting in his winner. So in this case, right, we can see in both of these cases, it still transmits from Clinton in this, and then we can see in 2008, Obama winning the majority of the popular vote, which then can calculate right into the majority of the electoral college seats. But we have had instances, again, as we talked about in 2000 and in 2016, where that didn't, the math, actually the electoral college math didn't necessarily calculate out to the person winning the popular vote, also winning the electoral college seats. And so this is some of the things that we talk about, right? When we talk about, have debates among students, which is the problem with the electoral college and the problems of what our constitutional framers in many ways created by having these suspicions about not wanting the popular vote to decide the most, our executive office, our top office in our national government. And so on the top here, we see what looks like here in an electoral college map, where we can see how it makes it seem like in our country, we're either highly polarized, either all Republicans or all Democrats, because of the way that we calculate the electoral college. So this is in many ways can contribute to some of the belief here in the United States that we don't have a lot in common, right? That we are bifurcated into these contrasting, opposing parties that are these kind of red states and blue states. And that in many ways is because we can think about the electoral college. I think in some ways we can think about some of the problems that the mainstream media is doing by their excitement about talking about the electoral college, their excitement about trying to figure out who's going to win. But in many ways, this then projects to us this belief that we are really this split country between red and blue America. And I think you'll hear about this a lot, right, in the mainstream media, amongst editorials, where we'll talk about, red state people, blue state people, as if really we can typologize people into these really two, really only kind of bifurcated groups. In reality, what we have in the United States really is a very diverse population. And so on the bottom map, what you see here are really, in reality, these are all different counties in the United States, right? And it's still giving you the majority of the vote in each county, right? But because our counties, one, are much smaller, and also amongst counties, right, it really isn't split evenly. That in fact, we have what we call a lot of quote unquote purple areas, which are really areas that are most evenly split, right, between people who vote for the Republican candidate and people who vote for the Democratic candidate. And so if we actually present our country in this way on the very bottom, we can see that we actually, while we do have some very solidly red and solidly blue counties in the United States, many of our counties, right, are actually quite diverse counties. And if we really think outside of the Electoral College and really think about as everyday people who we're dealing with, right? We want to think more about how we are really operating in a really politically diverse environment. And I think in many ways we can see that even here at UCLA, that we are a very politically diverse community. And how can we, instead of thinking about ourselves in these two opposing camps, right? How can we have more collegial, right, and respectful conversations with one another, fully knowing more so, right, that we are engaging in a much more politically diverse environment. And so these are some of the things here that I hope we can kind of think through as you now understand, kind of why we make such a big deal about the Electoral College, because it does impact the outcome of the election. But it also culturally, right, in many ways, we want to think about some of the negative implications about overemphasizing this idea of the Electoral College and what it might be doing, right, to our political conversations that we're having on an everyday level. Now, one of the things that after I talk about the Electoral College is that people go, well, then I don't even want to vote, right? Like if this is just like this this system where the founding fathers weren't even intending for my vote to count, why even vote? Right. And so actually that's the opposite of actually what we should be thinking about for the electoral college vote. The electoral college actually means that voter turnout in and of itself is one of the most important things in a presidential election that we can think about, because if we are decided by a winner take all system, right, that if the electoral college is decided by getting 50% plus one of the state's votes, then who turns out, right, and how many can turn out for a particular candidate is the most important, right, practice that we can have in the United States. And in reality here, voter turnout is more of what I would argue we should be talking about. Now, when we think we're coming into the election, all anyone in the media now is talking about is who you're going to vote for, right? So they're only focusing on people who are regular voters. They vote all the time, right? And whether or not they're a swing voter or if they're a staunch Republican or a staunch Democrat. Everything in the mainstream media right now, as we lead up to Tuesday, is about what we call your vote choice, which is that you're already a voter and it's about who you're going to vote for, right? When in reality, what makes an election really exciting is how many new voters we can incorporate into the electorate every new election. And every new election, that is in many ways what decides the election, less so, right, these voters that vote all the time, right, that they are choosing which candidate to vote for. And our number one best example of the power of voter turnout is one of actually our most really recent elections, and is one of our most historic elections, which is the election of Barack Obama as president in 2008. Barack Obama's campaign in 2008 was effectively able to increase the total number of new voters, people who don't typically vote in an election, to get them excited about the election, to get them excited about the possibility, right, of having a say in who they were going to elect. Incorporated them and encouraged them to register to vote and cast a ballot in 2008. We had a record number of new voters in 2008, and we had a record number in particular of voters of color who entered the electorate, cast their ballot in favor for Obama, and effectively helped to choose the election of our first African-American president in 2008. And so this is one of, in many ways, should be our most inspiring story, in particular for our voters who typically don't feel that their vote matters. And we're going to talk, in my next slide here, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our history in the United States, which has historically excluded and discriminated against voters of color, particularly Black, Latino, and Asian American voters, for being able to cast a ballot, right? And so we have a lot of different voters in the United States who don't vote regularly, who, if they did vote, could see the power of their vote to decide the office of the president. And we have our most recent election in memory where voters of color did decide, because they voted in very high rates of turnout, increased their turnout from the previous election, and effectively are the reason why we saw the election of President Obama in 2008. And so we can see here one, and this is a lot of what I do in my research, which is really thinking about what are the possibilities, and how would our elected officials and who they are and who gets elected into Congress, to presidency, into the presidency, into many of our elected offices, if we saw more voters of color choose to turn out, right? And so many of the times, a lot of times we look at our elected officials, it is not a diverse set of people who represent our government. They're more likely to be white, male, have very wealthy, and older, right? It's really not a reflection of who we are as a country. And a lot of it has to do, right, with the types of voters that are really oftentimes turning out. Our most regular and persistent and consistent voters are white Americans who have the highest of all racial groups turnout rates in the United States across the nation, even here in California. White Americans do typically represent the largest voter turnout group in most jurisdictions across the country. And in that way, we can see that that then reflects the types of descriptive representatives. So in other words, the types of people who are ultimately elected into elected office, right? Many ways are elected by the types of regular voters who consistently cast election in a ballot in every election. As we see turnout rates increase for voters of color, we are seeing the important diversification of elected officials, one successfully, right, holding office across the entire country. We can see that most prominently here in California, but we are seeing increasingly, right, more candidates of color running for office and more candidates of color winning. And what I'm showing you here in this figure is the slow increase and uptick, right, of voter turnout rates of Latino, Asian American, and Black voters over time. We can see it's still underneath the trend line for white Americans. But there is in many ways a correspondence, right, with the growth of voters of color and the growth of representatives of color that are now in elective office. And so these are all here important empirical insights here that we can see of the importance of our voter turnout and the importance of really incorporating a diverse set of voters in every election. One of the reasons why we don't necessarily have a diverse electorate is, unfortunately, we have a history of racial discrimination, which has resulted in some rules implemented throughout history that racially discriminate against voters of color to be able to cast their ballot in the United States. And so if you take a history class, we talk about rules, historic rules in elections, such as things like a grandfather clause, which is that you had to have a grandparent, right, cast a ballot, be eligible for ballot in order for you to be eligible for a ballot, but then to vote. But then if, for example, if you were a descendant of slaves, right, who weren't able to cast eligible to vote in election, then you didn't have a grandfather, right, to say that voted for election, which then would give you registration rights to vote. We had things like literacy tests, which is that you had to be able to read something specific to be able to then vote in an election. Where oftentimes only voters of color were given the literacy test, whereas white voters were allowed to just go straight into the ballot box and cast their ballot. And so there have been historic practices throughout, including here in our home state, that have been used to deny access to voting for voters of color. But then in 1965, we had the momentous Voting Rights Act passed, which then made it unconstitutional to use these discriminatory practices at the ballot box, which then opened up this possibility for voters of color to more freely vote in our elections. Now, unfortunately, what's happened in our recent period is, with some conservative rulings by the Supreme Court, we've seen a rollback of voting rights protections starting from 2013. So within our lifetimes here, there have been sections of the Voting Rights Act that have been ruled unconstitutional, which then have allowed for local election administrators to then re-implement new registration practices, new election practices that possibly now we are monitoring to what extent they are racial discriminatory. So we can see here, I've got a little picture on the bottom left right corner here, which is the long lines today that oftentimes many people across the country have to wait in. Because starting in 2013, a lot of election administrators were closing polling booth locations, making it so that you had to really wait in these long lines. And so we're asking this question, right? If we really are supposed to be encouraging people to vote, why make people stand in line for 5 hours, 6 hours, right? That's going to discourage voters from wanting to cast their ballot on election day. And so we're monitoring, right, these possible discriminatory practices here, and to what extent these are more likely to impact voters of color than they are white voters, and to what extent then are there practices going on that are really trying to dampen voter turnout for voters of color in this country, which then, of course, then we have to think about if really this is about the importance of voter turnout, which can influence, right, the electoral college. If there are counties in the United States that are trying to dampen voter turnout, are trying to discourage voters of color from turning out, right? We can think about then how some of these election administrators are really trying to manipulate, right, how some of these election outcomes are going to end here on election day. And so this is why we are seeing a lot, and hopefully you are seeing these stories in the news. I think unfortunately what I'm seeing, as someone who studies this, is that there's so much attention about Trump that in many ways some of the important things that we would hope that journalists are covering, right, are some of these violations of voting rights protections. And this is some of the things that I think I'll voice my concern about as I watch our current coverage of the election, is that there is so much attention on some topics, right? But there is a lot of things going on in the United States right now that are really dangerous and in many ways will influence the outcome of the election, but oftentimes we are not covering them, right? Because in many ways, right, these are journalists who don't necessarily feel that these stories are newsworthy because they would rather cover something that they assume, right, people are more interested in hearing about. Okay, the last thing I want to share is, of course, the most important thing we want to say is that while the thing that we see the most about in the media and that people are talking about most often for Tuesday is the election of the president. But here in the United States, in every election, we also don't only vote for the president. We actually vote for many other important things that are related to governance in both national and state and local elections. And so one thing to be mindful of is that in the United States, we are structured what we call as a federal system. And by federal system, what that means is that there's different layers of government. There's the national government, there's then our state government, and then there's our local government, which, for example, would be our Los Angeles County, the city of Los Angeles, right? Our LAUSD school board. So the way that we operate in the United States is that for some areas of law and for governance, the national government is in charge of some things. And so this is how we think about and consider the role of the president. We then think about, and then the next layer down from our federal system is a state government, and the state of California, right, then can be responsible for other things related to our state governance, such as, the more specific environment of our country, our roads, right, various different types of things that happen here in California. And then our local government, which handles some of the things that we do, actually is some of the stuff that we really do more experience on an everyday level. For example, our homelessness, right? Our in many ways, our water quality, right? Our infrastructure here that we deal with on an everyday system, like our roads, right? Are decided by our county government. And so decision-making processes actually are decided at different levels of government. And this is kind of one of the things as we think about our activism, one of the most important things is you want to think about which level of government is in charge of this topic that I am worried about. So if I'm worried about, for example, immigration policy is something, for example, that's handled by our national government, even though in many ways it's being framed today as something that, for example, the state of California, right, is possibly responsible for, which is not true, right? And so one of the things here that we try to make sure people have clarity about is that only certain levels of government, right, are in charge of certain types of facets of our daily lives. And so these are the different offices here that we will be casting our ballot for. So here in California, right, we are going to be, of course, voting for president. An example here in state government is we have a U.S. Senate race that is going to be decided. Our U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein unfortunately died in office, and so we are filling her seat. We are going to be voting for the U.S. Senate office. And then the other types of seats that we will be voting for in our local government are things like County Board of Supervisors, maybe a city council member, right, a school board member, etc. And so that's actually I'm gonna skip over that one because I just talked about that. One of the things here is to note that even for national elections, while we think about the office of the president, the other important thing here that we will be voting for in this election is also the for Congress. And actually, maybe I should go back to this slide. So when it comes to our national government, we are a government of 3 branches. So we have, and this is actually not mine, this is something that I pulled, I thought was actually kind of useful. We have 3 branches in our national government, which is what we call the executive office, and that's where the office of the president, the legislative office, which is our Congress, and then a judicial, which is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not seats that we vote for as voters. The Supreme Court is something that is nominated by the president and then confirmed by Congress. But our 2 other branches of government, legislative and executive, are 2 branches of government that we do elect through the popular vote or through the indirectly through the electoral college. And in the United States, we have created this, what we call a system of checks and balances. So again, just like I was talking about national versus state versus local, even at the national government, we have important checks and balances where certain responsibilities fall into the legislative branch, our Congress, and some fall into the executive branch, which is president. And the idea that we have in terms of our constitutional powers is no one branch should be solely powerful, right, for any one aspect of American life. That ideally there is always some kind of check and balance. So just for example, like I just talked about the Supreme Court, right, the president gets to nominate the justice, but then the Congress is the one effectively that approves. And so the idea here is that we have no one responsibility held by one branch of government. For that reason, as we think about our next election, our congressional members are just as important as electing the president. A little bit of background here. We want to remember that for every state, we get 2 U.S. senators, which are made up of they make up our upper branch. 100 members make up the Senate. And currently, the partisan makeup of the Senate is nearly tied, right? So our current makeup is 47 Democrats and 49 Republicans, and 4 are independents, which are 4 of them have no clear party. In the Senate vote, usually it is a winning vote means that they need to get 51 votes out of the Senate. And so we can see when we have a breakdown of 47-49 and 4 independents, that it's actually a very, very close vote, right? If everyone votes on party lines. And so who gets elected to the Senate in this next coming election will actually decide, right, which party is going to hold the balance of power and possibly then be able to move bills through the Senate. And the same thing goes for the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives right now is made up of 435 members, where the members of each state is proportional to the state's population. So the more people you have in your state, the more representatives you have in the House of Representatives. And our current partisan makeup of the House of Representatives is also nearly a tie. It's 211 Democrats, 220 Republicans. And then right now we have 3 vacant seats for various different reasons that are being filled. In this coming election, all the U.S. House of Representatives are up for re-election, right? So there can be a whole new balance of power in our House of Representatives this coming election. We could potentially, right, change the partisan makeup of the House. And so this next coming election is going to be an important one here for deciding the legislative branch and to what extent, right, the legislative branch will be governed by one party or another, or if it will be perfectly nearly split, right, as we see today. And so these are some of the things here that we want to remind everyone that even perhaps if you might not necessarily be as interested in the office of the president, right, we could be interested in who your local House or Senate representative is going to be, because that is actually going to be something that can influence decision making at the national level. The last thing I just wanted to say is that here in California, we vote for, of course, our, state elected officials like our state assembly members, our board of supervisors, etc. But we also have something which we call a direct democracy system in the United States, which is basically laws that us as everyday citizens can put on the ballot that we as everyday citizens can then vote for. And so in California, we have 3 things that we can do as everyday citizens. Or one, you can put a referendum on the ballot, um, which is actually a referendum that is a measure already passed by the state legislature, but needs the popular support in order to be approved or rejected. So effectively, right, these are bills that our elected officials do run through the legislative process, but only if they're going to be turned into law is if they generate the support, right, of us as everyday citizens. And so that's a referendum. An initiative is a bill or a law that we as everyday citizens can petition to put on the ballot and to create our own policy proposal and then ask for a public vote on that initiative. And the third one we can do here in California is a recall, which is that if you want to remove a public official from that's already been elected in office, we can remove them through a popular vote. And so these here, as you can see on the bottom, is oftentimes what we in California, because oftentimes our um, elections for elected officials aren't as exciting, right? We consider, for example, California's considered a quote unquote blue state because for the last few election cycles, California has always supported the Democratic candidate. And so many times that doesn't necessarily make for a lot of exciting conversation, right, about how California is going to vote in the presidential election. So oftentimes what's really exciting in California are direct democracy initiatives that we are voting for. And these are the pictures here that you see on the bottom, where there are laws that we as everyday citizens, right, want to have passed. And we are deciding on, right? So we're not really relying on our elected officials. We are putting them on the ballot and voting for them using the popular vote. And so these are a number of initiatives here that we will be voting for here in California. We are very unique in that way, in that we have all 3 that we vote for. And here's a list here. I just thought I would show this. But one of the things that I do want to emphasize is that here in California, we have our own system. Every state, right, has different rules for what citizens can and cannot vote for. And so if you talk to friends in other states, right, their ballot actually will look different from what we have here in California because every state gets to run their own election. So this is something that is actually, elections are not a national phenomenon. They are rights given actually not only to states, but specifically to local county jurisdictions. And so the decisions and the administration first and the counting of our ballots are based at the local level. And so as we hear about conversations about whether or not, right, ballots are being counted, fairness in the election administration, this is something that's it's a very deeply local feature because it's our local governments that are the ones that are counting the ballots. Local governments also can decide what can and cannot go on the ballot. And so we can see here that you can see different states have different types of direct democracy. Some have no direct democracy at all. And some have only one. And then here in California, we have all three. But I also wanted to kind of integrate this conversation because I think we are going to have a conversation at the close of Election Day on Tuesday. To what extent ballots are being counted, right? To what extent ballots are being counted correctly and fairly. And this is something that's going to vary across each local jurisdiction because each local jurisdiction gets their own process to implement. So another example, for example, here in LA, we can vote 10 days in advance of election in person, right? You can actually vote as far out as a month in because we have a universal vote by mail, what we call universal vote by mail, which is that we get every single registered voter gets their ballot mailed to them and a month in advance. And so you can then mail in your ballot or you can cast a ballot at a voting center 10 days in advance. And so here in California, right, a lot of people have already voted, even though technically the election day is tomorrow. In some other states, you cannot vote early. So, which is why, for example, we see the lines, right? The 5 hour lines. You can only vote on Tuesday. So for some local jurisdictions, everyone will vote only tomorrow and the that local election administrator will have to count all the votes, right, within a very short span. And so this is why there's going to be some variation in when states can call the winner of the election in that state. But that's also going to be the reason why there's going to be a lot of conversation about to what extent ballots are being counted correctly, right? Because each county is going to have their own process. The last thing I was asked to address, right, of course, is since we're talking to our international student community as non-citizens, right, the vote is not necessarily something that you will have an opportunity to participate in. But in our American democracy, the vote is not the only way that we can participate in politics. And really, in fact, only voting is the political activity that requires citizenship in the United States but we have a list of a lot of other different types of what we call election and non-election activities so that you can participate in. So in terms of helping to influence the outcome of the election, while you cannot vote, you can actually participate as a non-citizen in the campaign itself. You can, for example, and these are some of the pictures, be involved in encouraging registered voters to vote and to vote for particular candidates, in which we call phone banking. You can call everyday voters, and so if you are a registered voter, what you would be experiencing right now is people calling you or texting you, sending you email messages, coming to your door, knocking on your door, trying to share with you about the importance of elections. All of that, right, are everyday people that really care a lot about who's going to win and want to encourage those who can vote to vote. There's also, of course, donations, right? People can donate to candidates that they really want to support. And so there are, of course, a lot of different activities that you can do to support a specific election. But for those of you who are not necessarily interested in the election, there's also what we would call non-electoral activities, which are activities that you can do to voice your position on a political topic that you care strongly about. And in our American election system, demonstrating your public voice helps elected officials to understand, right, what the public wants, what they as an elected official should support or not support. And this is some of the reasons why activities such as protesting and rallies can have a lot of important influence on our democratic system. And I think we have seen this here, even in our UCLA community, where we can see that our, even in our kind of local governance here at UCLA, where our university administrators, right, and leaders need to listen, right, to our students who voice their positions rooted in their rallies, in their protests, in encampments, right? These are ways that you voice your support or opposition to things, and that then helps, right, our leaders understand what kinds of decisions they can make. And protest is a very important tradition in the United States. It's particularly a tradition for those that have been disenfranchised or have been excluded from access to the ballot. It has a long, long, long history as a strategy for marginalized communities. What you see here on the lower right in the black and white picture says education is a human right. This was protest in response to Plyler v. Doe, which in the 1970s, right, was a Supreme Court decision trying to decide whether or not education for children of undocumented immigrants, right, should be provided by our local groups. And undocumented immigrant communities were protesting, right, their human rights as everyday citizens. And so we can see here really our power of protest here in the country. But even outside of protest, what you can do is you can be involved in your local civic groups, who also do various different activities to voice their positions. And actually, you can also write to a representative here in California. So even though you don't necessarily get to vote for that representative, as a resident, you can voice your position on an issue and share your position with an elected representative. And so you should feel your right to do that. So these are some very important ways here that you can express your political position, even if you are not a citizen and even if you choose or if you choose not to vote, right? So we have a lot of Americans here too that feel outside of the vote, they want to express their positions in different non-electoral political activities. Okay, so I'll stop there for my PowerPoint. And so hopefully this has helped to contextualize some of the things that we are hearing about the election in the media, and help to maybe clarify some of the things that maybe you have questions about. So I'll stop the presentation here, and I don't know if there's been some questions that have come up that I can help answer.
Thank you so much, Professor Masuoka.
That
I
went
appreciate it.
definitely over the 30 minutes, but
You're good.
I
You're good.
didn't
We're like
know.
three. Yeah, we're like 3 minutes over our session,
Okay.
but we'll go ahead and wrap up. If anybody did have any questions, we had just one that came through, but I believe you were addressing it like in the moment. It was about does each state get, so some folks in California in the electoral college are voting, want to vote red or want to vote blue. Do they get to split the delegates? And that's when you were talking about like the winner takes all.
Right.
So no, unfortunately.
Yes, no. And so when we talk about ways in which we can change the electoral college system, that is in fact a proposal, right? That we can actually change the Constitution so it's not a winner takes all system, and that we can make it more proportional, right? Which may then be a better way of reflecting our popular vote.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciated you sharing the different resources and ways that people in our international community can participate, even though they're unable to vote, right?
Mhm.
Um, I was a poli sci major back in the day in undergrad, so I wasn't aware though that the international members of our community could participate in all of those things. So that was super educational for me too. Um, Thank you. And I just want to let folks know that there's a lot of stuff going on at UCLA today, tomorrow, this week. There's watch parties I know that folks are hosting. There's a whole UCLA page, I believe, about just the different events and stuff going on this week. So definitely check that out. If you'd like to, watch election results come in with friends tomorrow. Yeah, and to give a quick plug, we're doing a follow-up event. Dashew Center is in January. So thank you, Caroline. We have a link there that I'll share I think it came through in the chat. We have an event that we're going to be hosting in January after the presidential inauguration, which will be, I believe, January 20th. We'll be bringing an immigration lawyer in to help answer some questions because we'll find out soon who wins this election, and we know that there will be a lot more questions that come up. Regardless of who wins, there will be questions, probably different questions either way, but we want to support our community and bring in an attorney to help answer those questions, hopefully relieve some apprehensions that folks are feeling, and just to provide some information and some education. Yeah, let me see. I don't think we've had any other questions come in, but thank you so much, Professor Masuoka, for doing this for us today. I really hope that the folks who attended learned a lot about, again, this has been going on at least all year, right? We even had changes late in the game where we had a new candidate get the nomination. So I'm sure they've been hearing a lot of this news just like US citizens have. So I appreciate you doing this for us today.
All right, well, thank you, and will be an exciting next day and a half. So we'll see what happens.
Absolutely.